Students, a very good morning to all of you. And once again, I welcome you to the class. Today we are going to discuss Samuel Beckett and the theater of the absurd. Students, the phrase absurd drama or the theater of the absurd gained popularity as a result of Martin Eslin's book entitled The Theatre of the Absurd that was published in the year 1961. In this book, Eslin points out that there is no such thing as a regular movement of absurd dramatists. The term is useful as a device to make certain fundamental traits which seem to be present in the works of a number of dramatists accessible to discussion by tracing features they have in common. This book deals with a group of plays which incorporate certain beliefs and use certain methods and which briefly and as a kind of intellectual shorthand we call absurd drama. Students, several dramatists have wrote dramas under this category. This kind of play, according to Martin Eslin, arises from the disillusionment and loss of certitude, loss of certain characteristic of times and reflected in works like the myth of Sisyphus that came out in the year 1942 by Albert Camus. In this book, this is an example where the word absurd appears. The major dramatists of the school of absurd are Beckett, Ajmer, Ionesco, and Janet. The senselessness of life and loss of ideals had, of course, been reflected in the dramatists like Enola, Sartre, and Camus. But whereas they had presented irrationality in terms of old conventions, dramatists in the theatre of absurd sought a more appropriate form. They do not argue about absurdity, they present it in being. Students, let us discuss very briefly some characteristics of the theatre of the absurd. The plays of this group are successful in spite of the violation of all dramatic conventions. The most surprising thing about plays of this group is that in spite of their breaking of the rules, they are successful. Martin Eslin here comments that if a good play must have a cleverly constructed story, these have no story or plots to speak of. If a good play is judged by subtlety of characterization and motivation, here in these drama, these are often without recognizable characters and present the audience with almost mechanical puppets. The next quality of this theatre of absurd is that facing a universe without God and without meaning or purpose is present there. This dictum is present there in these dramas. Eslin makes an important suggestions when discussing the significance of the absurd. According to him, the number of people for whom God is dead has greatly increased in the present century. The theater of the absurd is one of the ways of facing up to a universe that has lost its meaning and purpose. As such, it fulfills a double role. Its first and more obvious role is satirical when it criticizes a society that is petty and dishonest. Students, the next feature of this theater of the absurd is artist's individual vision of the world. Such a theater is involved in the relatively few problems that remain: life, death, isolation, and communication, and it can be by its nature only communicate one poet's most intimate and personal intuition of the human situation, his own sense of being, his individual vision of the world. This vision receives a form which Estlin sees as similar to a symbolist or imagist poem, in which, however, language is only one component and not necessarily the dominant one. For language has suffered its own devaluation, a fact which very contemporary from the point of view of either philosopher or the mass media. The effect of alienation is another feature of this type of theater. The resulting play produces the effect of alienation. We find it very difficult to identify ourselves with the characters in absurd drama. Thus, though their situation is often painful and violent, we can laugh at them. This drama speaks, as Martin Esslin has commented, to a deeper level of audience mind. It challenges the audience to make sense of nonsense, to face the situation consciously rather than feel it vaguely, and perceive with laughter the fundamental absurdity. The next quality of such dramas is lack of plot and characterization and limitations of language. In Waiting for Godot, two characters pass the time by playing games on the open road. In his second play, Endgame, by Butler, two characters play the final game shut up in a room. Here, a blind man, Ham, sits in a wheelchair as he can't stand, waited on by a servant, Chloe. And this Chloe can't sit down. In the room also, in dustbins are Ham's legless parents, Neg and Neil. The world outside is dead, or at least these four people believe that they are the last survivors of the race after some great catastrophe. Like Waiting for Godot, this play has been variously interpreted even as a biographical document embodying the relationship between Joyce and Beckett. Both these plays show a lack of plot and also, in the conventional sense of character, for a character presumes that personality matters just as plot assumes that events in time have significance, and both these postulates are questioned in the plays. In his subsequent plays for stage and radio, Beckett does not probe quite so deeply, but the themes persist. The difficulty of finding meaning in a word subject to incessant change, and the limitations of language as a means of arriving at or communicating valid truth. Students, many dramatists have been included in the category of absurdists. They include, if we look at the comment or the survey of Martin Esslin, who says, Tracing the forebearing of the absurd, Mr. Estlin leads us back to the mime plays of antiquity, to the Commedia dell'arte, to Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll, to Jerry Steinberg, all the young, Rimbaud, Emprecht Brecht, to Dadaist and Tristan Trezzari, to the surrealist and Antonin Artaud, the theatre of cruelty, to Kafka and to Joyce. All this is helpful and credible. But when Mr. Estlin ropes in Shakespeare, Goethe, and Ibsen as harbinger of the absurd, one begins to feel that the whole history of dramatic literature has been nothing but a prelude to the glorious emergence of Beckett and Ionesco. The point of this comment by Kenneth Tynan is that Estlin has included almost every important dramatist in his category of the absurd playwrights and has thus cast his net too wide. Students, this much for today's class. We will continue with this drama in our next class. Thank you very much.